Sehr verehrter Herr Dekan, lieber Arnulf, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Studierende, meine Damen und Herren, vor allem aber, lieber Perry. Es ist mir eine große Freude, dass ich Sie und euch zu dieser akademischen Feier anlässlich des 70. Geburtstags von Perry Schmidt-Leukel herzlich begrüßen darf. Ich tue dies im Namen der beiden Veranstalter des heutigen Abends, des Exzellenzclusters Religion und Politik, aber auch des Seminars für Religionswissenschaft und interkulturelle Theologie unter Leitung meiner verehrten Kollegin Frau Professorin Simone Sinn. Since this is not just a private party, but an academic event with international speakers, I will continue my remarks in English. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome this evening's distinguished speakers, Alan Race from London and Thomas Cattoi from Rome. Thank you very much for being with us on the occasion of Perry Schmidt-Leukel's 17th birthday and for speaking to us. I'm not going to give a laudation, because this is what you will do, dear Professor Race. I'll just say a few words about why I have such great admiration for Perry Schmidt-Leukel. Dear Perry, you combine two qualities that rarely come together. You know religion from the inside, and you take religious truth claims seriously. For you, religion is not just one cultural or social phenomenon among others, but religion, or more precisely, religions, have something meaningful to say. You listen very carefully to what they have to say, because you interpret religious texts and traditions in a very acute and detailed way. And in doing so, you find things, or as you call them, patterns, that are similar between different religions. For me, one of the most inspiring insights of your work in recent years has been the notion that commonalities between different religions are found not by generalizing, but by going ever deeper into detail. It is not the broad concepts that religions have in common, or if they have these concepts in common, it's not so interesting, but it's much more the details that reveal the thought-provoking commonalities between different religious traditions. And if I may say so, dear Perry, you are a master of detail, especially in Christian Buddhist studies. Dealing with details and at the same time integrating them into larger discourses on religion and its intertwining with politics is what our institution, the Cluster of Excellence, Religion and Politics, is all about. So, dear Perry, I'm very grateful for what you have done for our cluster, and I'm very grateful for your continued presence in our institution. Talking to you and reading your work is extremely inspiring, and I say so as a Catholic theologian, have learned a lot from you. I wish us all an inspiring evening. Thank you very much for coming.
Good evening also from my side. I'm going to introduce Dr. Alan Race, who's going to give the Laudatio for Professor Perry Schmidt-Leukel. Alan is a retired Anglican priest theologian and was ordained in 1976, and his career has embraced the twin tracks of ministerial practice and educational interest. His first book, Christians and Religious Pluralism, was published in 1983. I suppose that almost everybody in this room has read it. Since then, he has been the author of 3 more books and has edited several books and many articles. His latest book is entitled What Christ, Who's Christ? New Options for Old Theories. He is the chair of the organization The World Congress of Faiths and edits the biannual journal Interreligious Insight. Alan positions himself at the more progressive end of the Anglican spectrum and laments the lack of adventure in much of British theology. He has an honorary doctorate from the University of Leicester for contributions to interfaith relations in the city and interreligious theology nationally and internationally. Alan has enjoyed addressing different audiences, also at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and more recently at the European Academy of Religion. Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for such a kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. It's my second time in this fabulous city of Münster, and I came yesterday and have been enjoying the whole day looking around with friends. But we're here, I take it, for the purposes of celebration. And that's something to do with the figure of 70. I beat you to it, by the way, by a couple of years. You realize that. So, is our hero coming to see that all the world's a stage and that we are merely players? I hope you're on with the reference here already. Okay. He's called Shakespeare. And that one man in his time plays many parts. This man is a man of many parts, as has already been said, but shows no signs of surrendering his hugely productive life. But now is not the time, at 70, for sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. He is living proof that 70 is the new 50. So what to say? Picture the scene. Scholars of religions, some of them in this room, sit round the outdoors restaurant table for a convivial meal. To help the conversation along, someone asks the question, who knows what is the meaning of life? It would be good to know the answer. After all, every religion wrestles with this question, so someone here should know the answer. But there was silence. Into the silence, Herr Professor Schmidt-Leukel announces, I know the answer. No one is surprised. This is a true story. The learned professor has a reputation for knowing many things about many things. The answer, in fact, some of you might know this, was a number. The number 42. You know the reference there? I see some nods. Readers of science fiction literature will know the origins of the answer. It's from the novel The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, published in 1979, when, Perry, you were a mere 25 years old. 42 is given by deep thought. That's the fictional supercomputer as the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. You can think of this as depicting a kind of alternative world of sci-fi metaphysics. So you see why Herr Professor would be interested. Knowing many things about many things is a justified accolade for the birthday professor this evening. For, as we know, erudite works pour from his brain and out of his keyboard like a waterfall that never dries up. And the works are always educative, exciting, insightful, stretching the sinews of the mind with every jot, tittle, umlaut, and diacritical mark, as the evangelist Matthew might have said, accounted for. And we are the beneficiaries of such a creative intellectual showering. And for this reason, we are pleased to be here to pay honour. Your output, Perry, in fact, is astonishing. To date, you've produced, at least this is what you told me, 11 monographs, 21 edited works, 2 more in the pipeline for next year, and a zillion articles. some translated into Chinese, a fact itself that's worthy of great applause. And in true Deutsch systematic fashion, most of them are not thin books. I've been reading your recent The Celestial Web, a reference, everyone will realize, to Indra's net, which hovers over all life with jewels at the nodes, each node of the web, and each jeweled node reflecting the immensity of the whole, such that, as Perry indicates, and I quote here, the entire web is reflected and refracted in each of its parts. Thus, Indra's net is a fractal structure. And those who follow Perry's journey know that the fractal idea has become extremely important to him. Why? Because it helps us to navigate the tangled discussion of what is meant by what we call the religions, and therefore how we might discuss relationships between them at theological and philosophical levels. His sentences are always worth savouring, rather like a velveteen Spanish Rioja, which just happens to be my vino of choice. Here's one of those sentences. They're always, sometimes as well, deceptively simple. Religions, he says, are neither all the same nor incommensurably different, but they resemble each other in their diversity. Unquote. Think about it. Ponder this proposition further, and eventually a light is going to switch on. It's the kind of sentence designed to rescue a certain polarization in the debate about how we might imagine the relationship between the religions. Religions are not variations on the same phenomenal experience, so much is clear, but neither should we say they are so different as to be irreconcilably locked into different silos, so different that any comparative worth between them is said to be a fool's errand. They resemble each other in their diversity. In other words, the usual choices, religions are essentially the same or they're wholly different, are both incorrect, according to the professor. For some of us, this insight is a breath of fresh air in a debate which can get really stuck sometimes. I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, I know, Perry, that there have been struggles along the way in your determination to carve out a satisfying intellectual academic path suitable for your creative brain. That determination has served you well, and therefore us, the beneficiaries, also. You even managed to escape your German environs for a time and made your way to Glasgow in Scotland. How you coped with that dense Celtic accent, I have no idea. And I live in the country next door to it. But perhaps it wasn't so much of an alien land as might have been expected, because Scotland, along with Deutschland, was home to the legacy of the European Enlightenment, an intellectual current that has shaped us all, even if we think we've thrown it off. And Scotland was a great time of flourishing for you. I still treasure the series of dialogical books produced, with the help of your supporter, Gerald Weisfeld. These books were War and Peace in World Religions, 2004, Buddhism and Christianity in Dialogue, 2005, and Islam and Interfaith Relations in 2007. There may have been some others, but I missed them off here. All actually significant volumes at that period, at a time of increasing interest in the worth of dialogue between traditions. Perry was so creative in this period, he even invited me to lead a master's class, a seminar on religious pluralism with his students. I was given a hard time, and I could sense the impact of the master's influence. But your real triumph from time in Scotland was to be invited to give the very prestigious Gifford Lectures in 2015 at Glasgow, Lectures inaugurated in 1888 and given by many world-class luminaries, including people such as William James, Alfred North Whitehead, Ernest Hocking, and many other famous names, too many to mention. I think this was a sign of how much your work was being valued, a sign that a creative brain was cogitating in the religious, theological, and philosophical fields, and the rest of us needed to pay attention. And the lecturer did not disappoint. The Gifford Lectures advanced the novel possibility that the usual hardened distinction between pairs of religious traditions, when interrogated differently, actually demonstrate a resonance, an overlap, an echo of what is central to one also might have a place in another paired comparison. So, for example, the separation between the prophet of Islam and the son of Christianity might not be so fixed or deep as history and academic study has sometimes supposed it to be. Muhammad, for some Muslims, has a trace of sonship about him. And Jesus' sonship never abandoned, of course, the prophetic impulse. Or take the Buddha and the prophet. Very different traditions, seemingly estranged from one another as far as you might imagine. Again, however, the Buddha has a hint of prophethood about him. And the prophet's rejection of idolatry maybe could be aligned with that Buddhist letting go of those illusions that have a tendency to place human self-pretense at the center of things. We are learning to be non-binary in many areas of life. Why should this not apply to perceptions between religions? Why be either or when you can be both and? Which is not quite the same thing as saying you're a dual belonger. The final chapter in the Gifford's book introduced us to that fractal picture I mentioned earlier, and it's this that's informed Perry's thinking, I think, ever since. So let me repeat that deceptively simple sentence. Religions are neither all the same nor incommensurably different, but they resemble each other in their diversity. At one level, you might say this outlook is not entirely new. Some 19th and 20th century scholars came close to spotting much the same. But none worked it out, or in the process of working it out, as thoroughly as Perry has sought to do. In other words, while fractal theory does not prove theories pertaining to interconnectedness, he says that himself, Perry has nevertheless demonstrated that there's a job of theological work to do around them. And this is the case in his other major contribution to the scholarly study of religion, namely, theology of religions. Although theology of religions for many seems to have reached a sort of, I don't know where to go next with this in recent years, so that a number of scholars turn to other disciplines, comparative theology and so on, or post-colonial studies, etc. Perry's fractals chart a different angle of approach to the whole subject area of interreligious relations and theology, pointing us in the direction of pluralism. He says this in his last sentence, in a sentence in the latest Celestial Web book. And I quote here Perry, "The fact that fractal structures are particularly compatible with religious pluralism as an image of shared dimensions across religious life and practice." I skipped a line there, I'm going to start again. "The fact that fractal structures are particularly compatible with religious pluralism does not speak against, but for such pluralism." In other words, if fractals are a plausible image of shared dimensions across religious life and practice, then pluralist theory is accorded a boost in its own plausibility. Fractals speak for pluralism. Religious studies theories that want to isolate the religions in their silos therefore begin to lose a great deal of their own plausibility. I myself have sometimes said that the religions are both strange to and yet resonant with one another. If there was no resonance, we would not be able to feel the strangeness, and without the strangeness, we would not sense any resonance. I now value fractals as a way of helping me to make sense of these intuitions about the relationship between strangeness and resonance. There's another angle on fractals that deserves mention, and this comes to the fun part. This is that fractals have an aesthetic value. They're works of art. Take the following sentence, a sample from Perry's writings. The structure of the cauliflower is found in each of its individual florets, the structure of many tree species in their respective branches, and that of a fern leaf in its smaller leaves. Now, I happen to have a fractal cauliflower with me. And it struck me that this has a certain kind of brain look about it. Is there a strangeness and resonance between the cauliflower fractal and the brain that has introduced this image into religious studies? I mean, is this a professor's brain? Brains do look a bit like this. I hope you're following me here, and I think you probably are. The brain as a fractal cauliflower. The professor's brain as a fractal would explain his increasing interest in them. Think about that. I'm going to put it there. It's my visual image. Actually, this may not be as outrageous or as stupid as it sounds. I hope not anyway, for there is a neuroscientific view that the two hemispheres of the brain do function differently, yet together they actually seek and represent a wholeness. The left hemisphere being responsible for honing in on the detail of experience, on mapping individuality, but describing that individuality rather technically, sometimes over-rationally, and in isolation from other parts of experience. But the right hemisphere, on the other hand, and I'm quoting here from a neuroscientist, Ian McGilchrist, if you've heard of him, whose view is this, is what he says. The right-hand hemisphere sees a holographic world, a multitude of individually unique wholes that themselves form part of an even greater whole, which is filled with implicit differentiation. I thought that's all a bit celestial webby, isn't it? There can be a struggle, though, between the two sides for dominance. McGilchrist is masterful in this field and is clear that our technocratic society, in it, the left hemisphere's dominance is responsible for many ills. And what we need to do is reclaim the right hemisphere's role as the feeler after that intuitive wholeness. This means that in the field of religion, the theology of religion's search for wholeness has a greater claim on the human search for meaning than the necessary but limited concentration on the fragments of religious consciousness investigated by religious studies alone. Perry's fractal brain enjoys concentration on investigating individual sources of religious insight, but his instinct that they belong together in a greater fractal pluralistic wholeness is, I venture to suggest, what the world needs. More than me, neuroscience seems to be stumbling on it as well. Well, I've exhausted my time period now, I think, but I leave you, Perry, with one thought. A number of years ago, I heard a lecture by an internationally respected New Testament scholar. He said that when he became 60, he fell into a bit of a depression. I'm not saying this happened to you. But when he became 70, all by itself, the depression just lifted on its own accord. And he began to approach each day on its own merits, Each day, he said, became a source of delight for its own sake, and he gave himself to that delight to his great profit. May the same be the case for you. May each day be a source of delight for you, because we need that fractal brain to keep on working for us. All the world remains a stage, and we need to know the meaning of life. Thank you. Whoever's next, I'll take it away. Might get in the way of the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Your brain. Okay.
Let me briefly introduce the keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Thomas Cattoi. He currently holds the William and Barbara Moran Chair in Early Christian Theology and Interreligious Relations at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, in Rome. From 2006 to this year, 2024, he taught at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. His research and publications focus on the patristic tradition of the Christian East and on Buddhist-Christian dialogue, with particular attention to the Tibetan tradition. Since 2015, he has been the co-editor of the journal Buddhist-Christian Studies, and also co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Buddhist-Christian Studies, which actually received the Frederick Strang Book Award this year. Now, his last work is Seeking Wisdom, Pursuing Compassion, a philocalic commentary on Tsongkhapa's great treatise. It is forthcoming with Brill Publishers. We look forward to this book, and now we look forward to your keynote address. Thank you.
And I'm afraid I don't have any entertaining stage props here, like cabbages or anything. So just a couple of words. So guten Abend alle. Also vielen Dank für die freundliche Einführung. Bevor ich anfange, möchte ich mich bei Perry Schmidt-Leukel und der Universität bedanken für die Einladung, für die Möglichkeit hier zu sein und die Möglichkeit, eine für unser Feld so bedeutende Persönlichkeit zu ehren. So, nochmals danke und nochmals alles Gute zum Geburtstag. Aber trotz dieser Einleitung wird die Vorlesung jedoch auf Englisch gehalten. So, and I changed the title somewhat, because I thought we have to hear more about fractals. We are all so fascinated by fractals that I'd rather talk about fractals than intersectionality, so forgive me, but I'll sort of stray from what I thought I was going to do initially. And I just have a few pictures so people don't fall asleep too quickly. Now, let's start from normativity. On March 18, 1716, after a long journey across the Tibetan plateau, the Italian Jesuit Ippolito Desideri, and this is the only image we have, reached Lhasa. Born in the city of Pistoia in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, Desideri had gone through the customary Jesuit education at the Collegio Romano, which is today's Gregorian University, really, before his application for the Indian mission was accepted by Michelangelo Tamburini, the then general of the Society of Jesus. Desideri left Rome in September 1712, reached the Jesuit mission in Goa 1 year later, eventually reached Agra in India, in northern India in fall 1714. He and his Portuguese companion Manuel Freire would then undertake a long and difficult journey to Tibet. This is not very clear, but there is a red line which actually shows where they went. They stopped for a while at the court of the king of Ladakh. Then they joined an armed caravan for a 7-month-long trek across the Tibetan plateau. After the two Jesuits reached Lhasa, Desideri would soon be abandoned by his companion, who returned to India via the Nepalese route. Desideri would remain in Tibet until in January 1721. As a consequence of a protracted controversy with the Capuchin order that claimed sole jurisdiction over the Tibetan mission, he received an order from his Jesuit superiors to leave Tibet. In 1727, Desideri eventually returned to Europe, where he hoped to argue in favor of the Jesuits present in Tibet. But 5 years later, the Vatican authorities confirmed the Capuchins' exclusive rights to the Tibetan mission. So Desideri died in 1733, without being able to ever achieve his dream to return to Lhasa. Now, his work was only really published in the 19th century. His memoirs carry the titles Notizie storiche del Tibet e Memorie dei viaggi e missioni ivi fatte, usually known as La Relazione. During his last years in Rome, Desideri was preparing the publication of his text, which was alas thwarted by the Congregation de Propaganda Fidei, and his decision not to allow Desideri to return to Tibet. But in the Relazione, we have the earliest and most comprehensive account written in a European language of Tibetan culture and religion, demonstrating Desideri's uncommon grasp of Buddhist philosophy and practice. So in the 1950s, the Italian Orientalist Luciano Petek oversaw its publication, and the English translation came out in 2010. I'm not sure that a German translation actually even exists. Desideri's work, however, went well beyond the Relazione. His mastery of the Tibetan language allowed him to author a number of treatises in classical Tibetan that dealt with questions such as the existence of a first cause, thereby refuting the Buddhist teaching of codependent origination, or the belief in reincarnation. These works were made possible by his stay at the great monastic academy of Sera, which is just outside Lhasa and it's still there today, where he familiarized himself with different Tibetan philosophical systems and the monastic tradition of debate. He himself learned Tibetan enough to actually engage in debates with monks from Drepung and Ganden, which at the time was the largest monastic academy in Tibet. The Italian Jesuit had been exposed to philosophical debates at the Collegio Romano in his youth, and most likely was startled and intrigued to come across an analogous tradition in such a radically different world, a tradition where reason and philosophical speculation also played an important role, but functioned in a very different way. Desideri soon realized that his interlocutors were willing to listen with kindness to his position, but they were also firmly convinced of the correctness of their views. And therefore they wanted to discuss every philosophical claim in great detail, using logical reasoning. The Tibetans were open to be challenged, but they would not allow anyone to merely instruct them with a different worldview. Thus began the adventure of Desideri's engagement with the Tibetan speculative tradition, an engagement that was spurred by a desire for intellectual encounter and certainly acknowledged the extraordinary sophistication of the position of his interlocutors. And we can see that in these 4 treatises that I listed here, 3 shorter treatises and a longer treatise with this very impressive title, which is really on reincarnation and Pratitya Samutpada. But again, all these 4 treatises are permeated by one thing, a deep conviction of the philosophical normativity of his position. And this is a key point that I'd like to explore at some length, because it allows us to map the trajectory of Buddhist Christian studies over time, but also to position the work of Perry in the arc of the field's development from its inception until the present. Now, when Desideri mastered the Tibetan language to the degree that he could read Tibetan Buddhist texts in the original, and he was most likely the first Westerner to actually ever do so, and he could also write his apologetic treatises in classical Tibetan. He was doing something unprecedented, though some testimonies of Buddhist Christian encounter can be found even in the first centuries of the Common Era. So, for instance, in the Stromata, 115, the Christian apologist Clement of Alexandria, who lived between the 2nd and the 3rd century, writes, quote, "Among the Indians there are philosophers who follow the teachings of Buddha, whom they honor as a god because of the excellence of his sanctity," unquote. And then the Xian stele of 781 tells us that the Assyrian Church of the East had been officially recognized by the Tang Emperor Taizong, early 7th century, following the arrival in China in the year 635 of a group of Syriac-speaking missionaries under the leadership of a monk by the name of Alopen. Some scholars, perhaps somewhat outside the academic mainstream like Francis Tiso, try to argue for an actual historical influence and cross-fertilization between Eastern Christianity and certain strands of Buddhism. For my part, I don't find this claim, this theory, particularly convincing, as the points of contact between different spiritual traditions do not necessarily indicate a common historical source. Medieval figures, in fact, such as Thomas Aquinas, were in fact utterly unaware of the existence of Buddhism or indeed any of the Dharma traditions, as they positioned Christianity solely and exclusively within a historical and eschatological dialectic between the Jewish dispensation, voided by the coming of Christ on one hand, and the challenge of Islam on the other. It was the speculative vision of Thomas Aquinas that laid the foundations for the theological synthesis in which the great missionaries of the Tridentine era, such as Desideri, were educated and came to understand the religious traditions of an Asian continent now open to European exploration and indeed colonial plunder. Now, to talk about something slightly more contemporary that many of you will be familiar with, in his Hindu God, Christian God, How Reason Helps Break Down the Boundaries Between Religions, the American Jesuit scholar Francis Clooney argues that the Christian theology of the future must have a number of specific characteristics. First of all, it must remain confessional, or in other words, it must be rooted in a specific Christian ecclesial tradition with its attendant doctrinal commitments. Secondly, it must continue to be systematic, seeking to offer a comprehensive speculative account of the Christian faith. Thirdly, however, it has to be dialogical, as it can no longer be limited to an internal conversation among followers of the same creed, but it must go out into the world and engage members of different religious traditions in a dialogue, raising fundamental questions of soteriology, anthropology, the nature of ultimate reality. Finally, however, and most importantly, the theology of the future has to be comparative, which means that theologians must be open to claims made by other religious traditions to the point of being vulnerable, this is actually his term, to the potential truths that they may discover within these traditions. The comparative theologian who reads a page of Christian theology about a particular speculative question and then reads a page by a Hindu or Buddhist author about an analogous speculative question must be ready to be transformed and challenged. When he or she returns to the original page of Christian theology, she may understand it in a completely new way, foregrounding aspects of its claims that until that time had never been fully grasped, or sometimes even alerting them to the fact that some of their earlier understanding were simply incorrect. So comparative theology will allow Christians to open themselves up to the wisdom of other religious traditions without letting go of their own. And if they follow Clooney's advice, they will become even more attuned to the specificities, the particularities of their own tradition, which the encounter with the religious other will have illumined in a new way. Clooney lays out these guidelines for everyone to follow. But how do you actually do that? How this can be put in practice is actually not so simple. And perhaps there is one aspect of his vision that is not always given a lot of attention, namely Clooney's claim that we can solve interreligious conflicts and break down the boundaries between the religions using reason. Reason, but which one? Which reason? Which reason? There are so many. I mean, there are so many different understandings of reason. You see, you read this title, Reason Helps Break Down the Boundaries Between Religion. But which reason? And he doesn't really talk about that very much or address this. And I was his student a long time ago, and we tried to push him on this point, but we never got a very real answer. See, now his assumption seems to glide over the chasm, the distinction between Western understanding of rationality and their non-Western counterparts. So, to go back to Desideri, which reason did Desideri and all these other great missionaries of the time, Matteo Ricci, Roberto De Nobili, all these Jesuits who went to Asia, use? Which reason did they use? And that ultimately was the reason that sustains the medieval scholastic tradition derived from Aristotle and marshaled by Aquinas, and the latest scholastic tradition in defense of the Christian dogma. And this Aristotelian model of reason is really the model of rationality that we find in Desideri's apologetic works, such as the Byung-kun, which I listed earlier on, the Dawn, which is the work where the Tuscan Jesuit addresses and challenges the notion of pratitya samutpada, or in Tibetan it's called tendrel, codependent origination. So you see here a very classic iconographic portrayal, of the 12 spokes here representing the 12 stages of pratitya samutpada. What we find in Desideri's text is a critical but constructive appropriation of a Buddhist philosophical teaching in support of his own apologetics. An apologetic that comes wearing the heavy armor of the Aristotelian discourse on causality. So, on one hand, Desideri believes very strongly in the unique potential of the Thomist rendition of Aristotelianism, On the other hand, he also believes that alternative philosophical systems will contain in nuce elements that can only blossom when exposed to the sun of Christian revelation. And, well, ultimately, this is not so dissimilar from what even Karl Rahner would actually try and do. You know, in chapter 6 of Foundations of Christian Faith, many centuries later, Rahner would claim that the sacred writings of other traditions could also be considered inspired, even if this inspiration was partial and in need of correctives, so to speak. Now, let's go back to this Byung-Kun. In the first part of this treatise, Desideri explores the nature of the first cause and includes three arguments, three themes. Number one, the existence of a first cause, which is the origin of all things. Number two, the eternity of the first cause. Number three, the independence of the first cause from all contingent realities. Now, Desideri notes that every aspect of the, well, he argues to his Tibetan audience that every aspect of the natural order must have a principle or an origin. And he even says, it's very funny, the happiness that I can see in Tibet today clearly must have its origin in the head of the family, and clearly Khlab Khan, the de facto civil ruler of Tibet, whom Desideri calls king, must be the source of happiness for the whole country, because he's also writing, of course, for the civil authorities. Now, his understanding of causality stresses how every cause contains in acto within itself what will be manifest in potentia in the effect. That's very scholastic. Whatever is being moved, for instance, has received the action of a cause moving it. In living beings, the movement is of course imparted by the vital principle, while in the case of inanimate beings, the movement is imparted by some other agent. And Desideri even mentions, some of you may be familiar with this, the Tibetan belief in a sky that has many levels, where the highest sky imparts movement on the lower skies, but the highest sky does not require any other power to move. See? If this is the case, he says, it is then possible to think of a cause that does not depend on any other cause, but causes all movements because of its intrinsic power, like the soul that moves the body. So what is going on here is that Desideri is trying to replicate Aquinas' appropriation of the Aristotelian discourse on causality that can be found in the Summa Theologiae by relying on an example that is familiar to his Tibetan audience, so as to show that the notion of the prime mover is not so alien to Tibetan culture after all, if they really think about it. Similarly, Desideri acknowledges that the Tibetan emphasis on the transitoriness of all things is not without its merits. The teaching of codependent origination, with its assertion that all things come into existence and disappear, echoes the sober pessimism of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. Yet, Desideri claims that the Tibetan understanding of pratitya samutpada does not acknowledge that if all things at first did not exist and then they existed, there must have been a prime mover that arranged the whole world in an orderly fashion from the start. And he goes on to read Tsongkhapa's great treatise, which, as you just heard, I've been reading for quite a while, as well as Asvaghosha's praise in 150 verses. And he says, look, even you Tibetans have the desire to seek refuge in a perfect cause. And you're turning the Buddha into a virtual paradigm of perfection. Without discussing the theory of the Buddha bodies, which is not really present in the texts he is engaging, Desideri claims that the Tibetans have an unacknowledged desire for a first cause to provide ontological support for pratitya samutpada, and then turn the Buddha into such a cause. But the Buddha, Desideri says, cannot be such a cause because the Buddha might have had extraordinary attributes, but cannot possess infinite powers to rule over the whole universe without limits. Hence, you need correctives, from Aristotle. Desideri's strategy ultimately is to show that the Tibetans' own philosophical traditions, once its implications have been brought into the open, effectively proves the superior rationality of Christian metaphysics. Now, if you followed me until now, you probably realize a few things. Number one, the first is that Desideri's approach to Buddhist-Christian dialogue rests on what now we, to use a contemporary term, would call a partial fulfillment approach. Desideri believes that there is much that is true and valuable in the Buddhist tradition, but also that the Buddhist tradition is flawed and in need of metaphysical correctives. I had a few things here. He does acknowledge that there are metaphysical claims made by his interlocutors, but these have to be critiqued to pave the way for an explicit acceptance of Christianity. But things are much more complicated than that, because if you actually read Nagarjuna's, for instance, Nagarjuna's own writings on Majjhimaka, you will start wondering whether Desiderius' approach fails to capture Nagarjuna's fundamental critique of causal mechanisms. This is a very imaginary portrait of Nagarjuna. Because Nagarjuna, asserting the emptiness of sunyata, as opposed to the existence of an ontological ground in the form of the first cause, says that asserting the emptiness of sunyata amounts to asserting that codependent origination offers a coherent explanation of the universe. We don't need anything else. However, Desideri somehow couldn't see that because of his belief in the universality of Aristotelian rationality and his conflation between Aristotle's first cause and the Christian God. So Desideri fails to see that shunyata transcends the taxonomy of causality altogether, because it rests on the self-explanatory and exhaustive presence of a web of conditions that engender phenomenal regularities, even in the absence of inherent substances with causal powers. So in this case, the reason invoked by Clooney in his work on Hindu-Christian dialogue turns out to be a very Aristotelian version of human rationality, leaving us to wonder whether perhaps, despite the title of Clooney's work, certain kinds of reason actually keep the boundaries between religions firmly in place. They do the exact opposite of what he thought he would do. Now, what could be an alternative to this methodological strategy? In 2002, in his seminal work Introducing Theologies of Religion, Paul Nitter presented a variety of epistemological paradigms, trying to map the relationships between different religious traditions. The last model Nitter presents, and I'm sure many of you have read this, the last model Nitter presents in his book is the so-called acceptance model, an approach asserting that all different religious traditions are bodies of practices that practitioners inhabit, but cannot be regarded as attempts to offer exhaustive metaphysical descriptions of ultimate reality. And indeed, the very existence of an ontological referent for the speculative claims of the different traditions is questioned. If, in Derrida's words, the signified is perpetually sliding under the signifier, here the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Jesus as well, is being sucked under the rag of a post-metaphysical theology where postmodernity and deconstruction join in what is a de facto flight from ontological claims altogether. And such an approach supposedly ensures tolerance between practitioners of different religions and effectively eliminates, I lost myself here, and effectively eliminates the rationale for theological disagreements. If Desideri's metaphysical vision was clearly shaped by his Roman formation, Nitter's intellectual trajectory, which actually included the licentiate at the Gregorian University, which is kind of the same institution in a sense, indicates clearly a rejection of the same, Nitter's position, which eventually led to his decision to leave both the Roman Catholic priesthood and embrace dual belonging as someone practicing Tibetan Buddhism and Christianity at the same time. After all, if religious traditions are ultimately texts or props for a kind of spiritual performance, why should one not choose to perform Buddhism and perform Christianity in different contexts? No one questions the integrity of actors playing Macbeth one week and King Lear the following week. See, Shakespeare comes back again. This approach to interreligious dialogue dovetails then, Nitter's approach to interreligious dialogue dovetails with the speculative reflections of authors such as Gianni Vattimo or John Caputo, who have called for the radical rethinking of Christian theology in light of the death of metaphysics, developing a so-called weak theology, la teologia debole, la fede debole, etc., that is nonetheless haunted by ontology, or as they put it with a touch of humor, hauntology. Some of you will get the joke here. Okay, that's La Bocca della Verità in Rome, in Santa Maria del Cosmedin, and I walk past it like almost every week, and with a really long line of tourists trying to put their hand inside this hole. So if you don't say the truth, the statue will cut off your hand, supposedly. Now, if reason, to go back to Clooney one more time, played a role at all, this time reason might have managed to eliminate the barriers between different religious traditions. In Nitter's system. But this time, reason will also empty them of all actual significance. And this is not going to impact just Christianity, because even within Buddhism, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, the Tathagata Garbha teaching on the Buddha nature, they would all vanish into thin air. And the result is that they all leave the stage ready for some kind of diluted New Age Dharma that avoids theoretical confrontation and instead focuses on a non-threatening version of spirituality, which is a very dangerous word. Now, by the time we get to the world of multiple belonging, the flight from the normativity that permeated Desideri has reached its destination in a colorful but arguably rather shallow cafeteria of practices where different menus may be served on different days, but they're all suitably adjusted to the taste of Western consumers. Nothing is too tasty or too demanding. Now, today we are meeting to celebrate the work and the legacy of Perry. And while my task is not to offer an overview of his work, and we've heard some of that before, what I really believe is, I just want to say that what is an important aspect of his contribution to the discipline of Buddhist Christian studies as a whole is the fact that his engagement of the two traditions and his constant wrestling with the points of contact and the tension between the two, I think helps us escape this unhelpful dichotomy that I have outlined, you see. On one hand, Desideri would have us embrace some kind of metaphysical meta-narrative that does not really honor the particularity of the other tradition, and on the other hand, sort of postmodern approaches such as Nietzsche's would just drain both traditions of all ultimate import, so that the conversation between Buddhism and Christianity will appear almost like, this is Joseph O'Leary's expression, a ludic exercise, a game of sorts, a linguistic game. Is there not a better way? And here is why I want to, again, talk about fractals a little bit, because I think in this system, this approach avoids the traps both of the classical Aristotelian normativity that kind of becomes a hurdle for Desideri, and also postmodern linguistic reductionism. So here we are back to das himmlische Geflecht, where, well, Perry sets out to explore different approaches to theologies of religious and comparative theology, and what is the starting point? Indra's net, a celestial web adorned with jewels, where each and every precious stone reflects the totality of the web. As you know, this comes from the Atharva Veda, but even the Avatamsaka Sutra actually uses this theme, suggesting that the entire world in a fragment lets us see the whole universe and its parts as mutually penetrating and complementary realities. And at the same time, it keeps us focused on the distinguishing characteristics of its different elements. Now, applying this framework to Buddhist-Christian dialogue helps us leave behind an understanding of Buddhism and Christianity as doctrinal monoliths. In this new perspective, Buddhism and Christianity are now revealed to be multi-layered and sometimes heterogeneous structures. Setting out to explore the differences between the traditions, one discovers a pattern where visible differences between the traditions can also be seen within each tradition, hence the cauliflower. The result of this strategy is a mutual interpenetration of different religious beliefs and practices which can enrich and perhaps even correct each other. Perry likens this to Wittgenstein's notion of the Familienähnlichkeiten, as well as Peter Ante's observation that each of the distinct schools of thought within a specific tradition will encompass the distinct tendencies that gave rise to different schools of thought in the first place. So, for instance, chapter 6 of Das himmlische Geflecht deals with the presence of higher and lower Christologies and the analogous presence within Buddhism of distinctly higher and lower Buddhologies, noting the fundamental difference between the theistic framework of the Christian tradition and the fundamentally non-theistic or functionally pantheistic approach of the Buddhist tradition. Now, if we, for instance, subject to this fractal hermeneutic the Tibetan and the Eastern Christian soteriology, which is not something that actually Perry does in this book here, we actually also encounter very striking fractal resemblances. And yes, we are doing this with the provisos that both, the Tibetan, when we talk about, let's say, the Tibetan tradition or Eastern Christianity, we are not talking about the work of a single author, but a whole succession of different voices spread over hundreds of years. In Tibet, we find Tsongkhapa's own take on Prasangika Madhyamaka, a radical rendition of Nagarjuna's teaching on conventional and ultimate reality that deconstructs all positions in a way resembling the Western reductio ad absurdum, a strategy that questions the very possibility of holding a view, but foregrounds the soteriological value of a radically empty Buddha nature. In the Christian East, we find a whole plethora of distinct conceptualizations of salvation, from Evagrius' dissolution into an undifferentiated noetic henad, to the theology of deification, which can be traced to authors such as Maximus or the hesychasm of Gregory Palamas. These are all different visions, yet they are theological approaches that affirm the enduring value of the subject and its eschatological transformation in the embrace of the divine. I should just stop here, I guess, here. So both the Tibetan and the Eastern Christian visions affirm the complementarity of contemplation and of practical or virtuous activities. And in both traditions we find other voices, Hashang's teaching and the practices of Dzogchen on one hand, the Evagrian school but the Messalian approach on the other, that privilege contemplation or meditative stabilization either exclusively or as the culmination of a process that leaves practical activity behind. So in each case, the first approach privileges the gradual character of spiritual practice. The second approach suggests the immediacy of awakening, or envisages contemplation as the recovery of an inherent characteristic of our condition. In addition, one understanding of the spiritual trajectory underscores the exceptional character of the ultimate goal of practice, Buddhahood, the hypostatic union, while the other emphasizes its availability to all, even its identity with the nature of our being. So this approach, Perry's approach applied to this sort of encounter between the Tibetan tradition and the Eastern Christian tradition would then be able to acknowledge the distinctive metaphysical claims that are operative in the two traditions without flattening them to mere speech, and yet without subjecting them to the Procrustean bed of a single metaphysical point of view. That like a Victorian headmistress subjects all alternative stances to the rod of her inflexible logic. And this is a stance that we can also find in many other works. Now, what Perry perhaps does not explain, if you allow me to say that, is the presence of elements in these traditions that resist this fractal family of resemblances. In other words, what is it that sets the traditions apart in the end? First of all, why is it that in the world of Tibetan Buddhism, alternative schools of thought could coexist, but within Christianity this was not the case? The Rangtong understanding of the Buddha nature and its Zhentong counterpart continue to exist alongside each other. But when the Council of Chalcedon condemned earlier Christologies that rejected the Cyrillian understanding of the Incarnation, well, it was no longer possible to profess them in public. At most, Tibetans or other Mahayana Buddhists could regard the holding of alternative viewpoints as a concession to a lower level of spiritual development. Chalcedonian Christians, for their part, would not regard Nestorianism as an acceptable derogation to the truth for Christians of regrettably slow intellect, just a heresy to be condemned. And even more important, there are tendencies within the traditions that push in different directions. Both Buddhism and Christianity comprise tendencies towards an impersonal and towards a personal absolute. But it is impossible to deny, I think, that in Buddhism the former, the impersonal, remains foundational, whereas in Christianity the latter, the personal, is constantly foregrounded. And if we look at the corresponding models of spiritual practice, the same dynamics are replicated. Ultimately, the Buddhist vision of nirvana gestures towards a dissolution of subjectivity, whereas in the Eastern Christian vision, the individual is deified within a natural order and envisaged as a gift from God that is destined to eschatological preservation. Now, perhaps the moral of the story is that all of us who engage in interreligious dialogue must accept that our task is destined ultimately to fail, or perhaps to fall short of the depth and the breadth of the traditions that we engage, that we choose to study. Desideri left Tibet in 1720 because of the political unrest there, but also because of the infighting between the Jesuits and the Franciscans that thwarted his missionary enterprise. His translations of the Lamrim was lost forever, and it would take centuries before this text became accessible to Western readers. Nitter, while academically very influential, has found himself at the margins of his own ecclesial community, arguing for a kind of syncretic religious practice that many would have found to be inconsistent with the actual claims of the Buddhist or the Christian traditions. And perhaps what happens with Perry is that Perry's fractal approach can offer us a synchronic picture of the encounter between two traditions, where the points of contact and the differences are emphasized at a given moment of time, or at least where they were in the past when considered from the perspective of a particular moment. But what perhaps we need now is a diachronic, dynamic perspective. Where do these differences evolve over time? How do some elements become prominent in a tradition when in another one they disappear or they become subordinate? And I think perhaps this should be the next goal for Perry or for all of us as scholars, etc. And here, I think we should conclude with a dedication of merit, okay, by Tanisaru Bhikkhu. We can all read it together if you want. May all beings, without limit, without end, have a share in the merit just now made, and in any other merit we might have made. Those who are dear and kind to us, those whom I have seen or never seen, and others neutral or hostile. By reason of their rejoicing in my gift of merit, may all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May they attain liberation and their hopes be fulfilled. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Ich habe gewusst, dass es schwer wird, jetzt irgendwie zu reagieren, deswegen habe ich mir ein paar Notizen im Vorhinein gemacht. This was really a wonderful night. Thanks to all of you for making this possible. I take it as a very special personal treat, and that it really was. And thank you, Alan, for now better understanding my own brain. I feel even more grateful in taking this night as a sign that my work in academia has been of some use and continues to inspire further reflection, including objections and disagreement. For this is the only way how we make progress in the humanities. Whatever kind of reason or rationality we mean, producing reasonable arguments that invite reasonable objections in order to find reasonable solutions and thus getting nearer to the truth. This is how science and also in the humanities should proceed. Unfortunately, in these days, all joyful events like tonight are overshadowed by the awareness that in the Near East, Muslims and Jews are slaughtering each other. And that in Russia, Eastern Orthodox Christians produce theological arguments to justify the slaughtering of other Eastern Orthodox Christians. And that in India, the Hindu majority is mistreating Muslim and Christian fellow Indians, and in Myanmar, the Buddhist majority is depriving Muslim citizens of their most basic human rights. Yet this shows that our work in interreligious dialogue and interreligious theology is all the more important, and that we must not cease in our efforts of pointing out ways to appreciate religious diversity as a gift. So thanks to Simone and Markus from the Institute of Religious Studies and Intercultural Theology, and to Angela and Michael from the Cluster of Excellence for hosting this event. Thanks to my esteemed colleagues and friends, Alan and Thomas, for taking the time to write their talks and travel to Münster. It was an intellectual delight to hear what you were saying, and there are a few things that I would like to continue discussing with you. Thanks to everybody in the audience for coming. Thanks to all you fine colleagues from various disciplines. Some of you I know for decades, and it was and still is such a joy to have had all the exchange and sometimes critical debates with you. You know how much I appreciate that you are here tonight, some of you traveling quite a distance. A special thanks goes to my colleagues from Protestant Theology in Münster, from the Cluster of Excellence, and from the wider university. My years in Münster have been and still are very productive, and your support and collegial friendship was and is so encouraging. Thanks, of course, to all who contributed to the Festschrift. I have no idea who, and I'm really very curious, but I heard, and I guess some are here tonight. Believe me, I'm so excited to read your contributions, and I will come back to each one of you to carry on the discourse. Thank you, Melanie, Matthias, and Fabian, and as I now learned, Wolfram, for putting this together. I know how much work is involved in editing a collected book. Editing can sometimes be more laborious and time-consuming than writing one. Thanks also to my family. Thank you, Doris, Dominic, and Amit, for accepting to live with a husband and dad who is mostly seen from behind, sitting at his desk in his study. It is so supportive to be surrounded by such dear and wonderful people as you are. Now, last but not least, thanks to all my students. One of the greatest satisfactions for a scholar is to have students such as you, who are eager to learn. Not all students are that, unfortunately. Who share one's enthusiasm of exploring uncharted ground, and who develop over time their own views and special skills in doing our demanding but privileged work. It is such a great experience to get the feedback that what I taught has been helpful to others. So, looking at the host of this event, I guess we will now be allowed to move on to drinks. I suppose we need to moisten our lips so that we can chat after so much listening, right? Thank you.